Hello, everyone. Welcome to Profitable Pastures 2021. My name is Terry Noon, and I am the chair of the Ontario Forage Council. This is the fourth of 4 webinars in this year's virtual conference. Because it is a webinar, although you can see and hear our presenters, we cannot see or hear you. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A feature, and Christine O'Reilly will share them with the presenter at the end of the talk. Thank you to the Beef Farmers of Ontario for their generous partnership of this year's webinar series. Thank you, BFO. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association. Thank you to the CFGA. If you're on social media, please use #ProfitablePastures. Today's session is called Carbon Markets for Forage Farmers. Our presenter, Cedric MacLeod, is the Executive Director of the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association. There has been a lot of talk about how farmers and ranchers might be able to make money from carbon offsets. Over the last few years, the CFGA has been working on a project to help make that possibility a reality. In his talk this evening, Cedric is going to update us on that project and the opportunities it creates and for forage farmers. We also have a co-host named Jonathon Alcock. He is the consultant with Viresco Solutions. He has worked with CFGA developing the Grassland Soil Carbon Protocol. All right, I'd like to pass that on to Cedric and Jonathon.
That's wonderful, Terry. Thanks so much. It's good to see. It's been too long. So thanks for the opportunity. John, give me a nod. How's my audio?
Yeah, it's good.
You're good? Okay, perfect. So listen, thanks to Ontario Forage Council and Patricia and Christine for giving us the chance to speak tonight. And also thanks to Beef Farmers Ontario, Richard and the team over there for sponsoring tonight's session as well. Really appreciate that. And pretty pertinent topic, I think, for the Beef Farmers of Ontario, dairy, and others that are managing forages. So I've asked John to come along with us tonight. John and I have kind of been around the country, I guess, over the last couple months, John, virtually, of course, presenting on the work we've done through our agriculture greenhouse gases program, kind of the results of that and the Canadian Grasslands Protocol. And we're pretty excited to tell you some of the background tonight and some of the findings that we have, some of the products that we were able to develop, and some of the plans for additional products that we plan to develop into the future, and kind of align some research work. Again, hats off to lots of folks there from Ontario. Christine O'Reilly has been a big supporter of this and really a great participant. Kim Schneider, new at the University of Guelph, has been quite active as well in some of the work that we're doing. So really enjoyed the interaction with all the research and extension team there in Ontario. So Terry introduced me as the executive director, but I feel more like the chief bottle washer these days, and that's why I really have got John along. We've got a lot of big projects in the hopper, and so I find myself doing a lot more administration than I ever thought I would when I went to school to be an agronomist, but that's okay. That's where we find ourselves. So John's been doing a lot of the heavy lifting on the technical side of the protocol, and has quickly become, I would say, the Canadian expert in how the protocol works and its deployment opportunities across the landscape. So I'm gonna leave it to John to take us forward. But one thing I would note that a number of you through Patricia and/or Christine probably recently worked through a questionnaire about how the protocol could be applied to your operation, and so they've worked closely with John on some of the technical questions that they've had. So, at the end of this, if you're interested, feel free to reach out to either Christine or Patricia or John and I if you want to take a look at how this works could work on your farm or ranch. I guess the other exciting thing that I'll say is we've got a fairly major project announcement coming up next week, Tuesday. And Terry, if I could, I might just pop, maybe while John's giving his presentation, I'll grab the link for that event that we're making our announcement. I'll just pop it in the chat. So be great if some of you folks from Ontario could pop in on that. It's going to be about an hour at noon Mountain Time on Tuesday afternoon during the PCAP meeting. So I'll put that in the chat. So without further ado, I think John, you're up. Have you got screen share opportunity?
Yep, let's bring that up now.
Okay, so I'm going to stick around, and then after we're done, if there are questions on the technical side or on the policy side, John and I would be pleased to take those questions. So thanks again for the invite, guys.
All right, thanks, Cedric. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to present here. I understand it's a lot later with most of you guys on the call than for me. Feels late for me, but yeah. So hopefully this will be engaging and at least interesting on a Friday evening. So yeah, so I'll be presenting on a few things this evening, mostly on the avoided conversion of Grassland protocol and how we got there, but also kind of why we ended up with that protocol, and also how we're going to be kind of taking it forward to look at different opportunities and new opportunities by filling some of the key kind of scientific and data gaps. So yeah, so in terms of an agenda, I just wanted to give sort of a quick overview on carbon offsets. There's a lot of talk, especially this week, with the federal announcement on the federal carbon offset system. So just wanted to talk about some key rules in carbon offset markets that are important to understand for the agriculture sector. And then I wanted to talk about the kind of landscape for grassland carbon in carbon offset markets, the story of how we ended up where we are today, talk about the actual protocol itself, and then, like I said, some thoughts and ideas and stuff we've got in the hopper for kind of next steps and more opportunities beyond this one. I should say if there's questions pop up during the presentation, maybe just scribble them down or write them in the chat, because I'll be covering a lot of content and sometimes it's difficult to remember what we talked about at the beginning, right? So I would just encourage people to sort of jot those down as we go through, and then we can come back to them at the end. So carbon offsets 101, a really quick introduction to carbon offsets and carbon offset markets. So a carbon offset is a tradable unit. So you guys will be familiar with commodities. So it's a good way to view a carbon offset as a tradable unit. One carbon offset is always equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. That doesn't matter whether it's carbon dioxide or whether it's a methane or some other greenhouse gas. And a carbon offset is equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that's either reduced or sequestered or not emitted. Carbon offsets are produced through methodologies or protocols, which are basically a blueprint for how a carbon offset can be generated. It includes all the science and all the kind of regulatory pieces behind what makes a carbon offset a carbon offset. And those methodologies or protocols are validated by the market registry or the market regulator. So that can either be a government in a compliance market, or it would be the market regulator would be kind of like a voluntary organization in a voluntary market. So the registry or the regulator also sets the standards specific to their own carbon market. Most markets adhere to the same ISO standards at a high level, but the specifics differ, in terms of the actual implementation of the market at a very granular level. And just to give an example, the Canadian Grassland Project's protocol is the protocol that defines how we can produce a carbon offset from avoided conversion of grasslands in Canada. It's approved for use by the Climate Action Reserve. So the Climate Action Reserve is the market regulator, and the market is the voluntary carbon market for Canada that's run by the Climate Action Reserve. So hopefully that's clear as mud. So in terms of the rules, there's a bunch of rules that offsets have to comply with, and lots of the time we get asked the questions, why is there so many rules? So there's two different types of markets: voluntary markets and regulated markets. In terms of regulated markets, or I might use the word compliance markets, those carbon offsets are used to comply with the regulation. So if you look at the carbon market in Alberta and how the carbon market will unroll federally, that's a regulated market. Carbon offsets are traded on the market to allow companies to comply with that regulation. In a voluntary market, carbon offsets are generated and traded on markets to achieve internal or external greenhouse gas targets that are voluntary in nature. So an example would be taking Microsoft. They're not regulated to meet emissions targets, but they are volunteering to do that, and they're volunteering to do so by buying carbon offsets on the voluntary market. So in terms of looking at credits as a tradable unit on an open market, the robustness of the credit is essential, or a lot of people say the quality of the credit is essential. In compliance markets, obviously, we have to look at, offsets have to comply with the regulation to make sure that the regulation is met. And in voluntary markets, there's been a lot of kind of media attention about greenwashing and negative media attention for, carbon offsets that aren't robust in nature. So that's on the voluntary market. Companies who are buying these carbon offsets need to know that they're not going to get accusations of greenwashing or buying something that isn't, achieving a real impact on the ground. So increasing the quality or the robustness of the carbon offset increases the value of the offset, particularly on a voluntary market, and reduces liability to both the market and the purchaser. Third-party verification is always essential to make sure that these carbon credits are robust and are achieving what they say they're achieving. The buyer needs to know what they're buying, but of course you can probably see this all adds cost, which is sometimes tricky to overcome. So 4 key principles for carbon offsets. First one is additionality. So this is a concept that offsets can't be issued for business as usual activities. So if something was going to happen anyway in the absence of the carbon offset, then that's deemed as an activity that is not additional and would not be eligible to generate a carbon offset. There's 3 ways that we can test for additionality. So the first one is a legal test. So is the activity required to happen by law? So if somebody's regulated to do a certain activity, that would not be eligible because the regulation does that job for them. That carbon offset isn't really achieving anything additional to that regulation or that law. Looking at common practice within an industry or within a sector. So if something is commonly used or a common practice within a sector, then that's not going to be deemed additional because it's already common practice. And finally, we can look at a financial additionality test. So looking at whether the carbon offset activity is just going to generate a financial value in of itself without the need for the carbon offset to provide that financial incentive to do the activity. Now, the main thing to say about additionality is those are the black and white rules, but the additionality, when in practice, it's always a gray area and it's always a point of contention. So yeah, so that's additionality. In terms of conservativeness, so we must always err on the side of ensuring that offsets are real and verifiable. So err on the side of caution in terms of how we quantify them. So if there's some risk, or if we're not quite sure on whether the offset is achieving the full offset, then we should always err on the side of, slightly less than more in terms of generation of carbon offsets, just to make sure that the offset is really robust and it is actually having an impact on the ground. In terms of leakage, this is where you're accounting for indirect impacts of an activity that might lead to an emissions elsewhere. So in terms of thinking about avoided conversion of grasslands, if you're avoiding the conversion of a grassland in one place, is that leading to conversion of another ecosystem or another piece of land elsewhere that might be leading to even more carbon emissions than the conversion of the original grassland? And then finally, permanence is a really big one, particularly for soil carbon that everybody's talking about right now. The way that accounting works for carbon offsets, we have to ensure that the carbon that is stored in the grassland or in some other ecosystem or even geologically, we have to make sure that that carbon is stored permanently to make sure that it has the impact on climate change that we are generating the carbon offset for. So offsets that are issued and then the carbon is later emitted for whatever reason, those offsets are then null and void, and that is a liability to whoever purchased the offset. So we have to guarantee that that carbon is stored in some way. Just to give you an overview of the types of carbon markets, I kind of touched on this already. Like I said, compliance markets and voluntary markets. Just some examples, the Alberta market, the British, the BC market in Quebec and California, and the federal carbon offset system. Those are all examples of compliance markets. And then there's other markets, on the voluntary side. And like I said, the Climate Action Reserve is a voluntary market, and a bunch of others. And the main thing to emphasize here, I suppose, is that the prices between the two, in terms of the price of a carbon offset on the market, in the federal or in a compliance market, the price is driven by the regulation, and that means that particularly in Canada, there's quite a high carbon offset price or sale price that's driven by the regulation. We're anticipating that's going to increase to $170 per offset or per credit by 2030, which really is a big game changer. If you look on the voluntary side of things, prices are dictated by supply and demand on a global scale. Right now, you can find carbon offsets on the global market for anything from $1 to $15 per offset, and that's driven by, like I said, supply, demand, and then the quality of the offset too. So that's a little bit of background on carbon markets. Now I'm going to get into the landscape for grassland carbon in terms of where we've come from and where we've ended up and why. First, a little note on soil carbon stocks versus soil carbon change. This is a nuance that often is mixed up, and it's really important to understand the difference between a soil carbon stock and a soil carbon change in the context of carbon offsets. So soil carbon stocks are the stocks of soil carbon that are in an existing soil store already. So they're usually measured in terms of amount of soil carbon stored in the top 30 or 50 centimeters. This is what we can actually measure when we go out to the field and take a sample and measure soil carbon. We're always measuring the soil carbon stock that's in the field at that point in time, or in the sample at that point in time. On the other hand, soil carbon change is the change in total soil carbon stock over time. So we can have a look at what the soil carbon stock is at time A, then come back a few years later and measure it again, and that's the again measuring the soil carbon stock at time B, and the change is obviously the difference between the two. Changes obviously are influenced by lots of things, weather, climate, land management, lots of lots of different things impact the change in soil carbon over time. And this is often a very incremental change. Less than 1% of total soil carbon stock per year is something that we could expect to see in terms of the percent change of that percent change over time of that total carbon stock. So you can see that, you know, if we're trying to measure for less than 1% change over time, and we have to wait a few years to measure that 1% change, there's a lot of error, a lot of variability in there that we have to try and account for in that measurement of a stock at time A and a stock at time B. And it's really difficult to get those really precise measurements to detect that 1% change. So yeah, given the accuracy of the measurement tools and variability, like I said, over time, soil carbon change is really difficult to detect. So in terms of where we've come from and where we started on this, we first started looking at a measurement-based protocol. This would be obviously based on actual measurements of soil carbon in the soil, measuring it over time to actually, and then generating carbon offsets from that soil carbon change that's detected. We'd obviously have to define the measurement tools. It would allow land managers to implement their own management practices, and then we just measure the actual change. The management practice itself is, you know, up to the land manager to decide. But we found that soil sampling costs and workload are prohibitive. Remote sensing technology is not quite there yet to provide a solution to those sampling costs. And linking the measurements with biogeochemical models could be one way to reduce the number of samples that are needed. But given the current state of things, we decided that wasn't a way forward for a soil carbon protocol on grasslands at the moment. So then we had a look at a practice-based protocol. So this is really looking at, can we use models to look at grassland management practices and then predict what the change in soil carbon would be based on that land management activity. So we'd obviously have to compile all the scientific research, collate all the information on improved or high performance management practices, and then use, like I said, use models to link that management practice to predictions in soil carbon sequestration. Again, we found that probably is not feasible at this point in time, just because there's so much variability in the management practices that happen on the ground and the actual conditions on the ground. You know, the models that we have are just not good enough to make those kinds of predictions yet. I should say the models and the actual data that's available just isn't there to sort of build out that type of a protocol just yet. There's also a lot of kind of argument in the scientific community about standardizing how we measure and how we model and how we kind of make these predictions. And of course, this would be prescriptive in to some extent in terms of the land management practices that a landowner would have to do to generate carbon offsets, and that's not always a very practical solution to be prescriptive about the land management types. So we also had to knock that one on the head and say that's a no-go for now. And then obviously we looked at the avoided conversion option. So this is just looking at what's the soil carbon that's actually stored there today, and then proving that there's a risk of that soil carbon store being lost, and then awarding offsets for land managers that ensure that the grassland is preserved, that those soil carbon stocks are preserved. So primary concern is that the primary concern is the grassland and the soil carbon loss. So the management for carbon increases are secondary. So really, we're not looking at a management-based protocol here. We're just looking at maintaining the stock that we already have. We have the science for this. This is national level science that Canada has developed that we can use for this. And it's a very simple approach to begin with, at least in terms of the technical and scientific side of things. The biggest thing I would say on this is the proving that the grassland is at risk of conversion. Getting back to that question of additionality. So that's what we did. We pursued this type of a protocol, and I unfortunately only have numbers for Alberta in this presentation, but this slide is really just saying that we have a really high rate of loss of perennial grasslands, not just in Alberta, but across Canada. That leads to a really significant loss of soil carbon stores. So the potential is certainly there, and could carbon markets provide a solution to preventing that loss of soil carbon. So, like I said, this is the avoided conversion of grasslands protocol that we ended up with. I'll take you through the protocol just quickly. It's a series of firsts, so it's the first carbon offset opportunity for Canadian grassland managers. Lots of opportunity before in the cropping sector, but nothing for Canadian grassland managers until now. It's also the first avoided conversion opportunity in Canada. So it's the first carbon offset opportunity that's been generated for the avoided loss of a carbon store, which is a bit of a new kind of concept. And also it's the first protocol under the Climate Action Reserve voluntary market for Canada. So I kind of touched on this already. The critical point for to consider for this carbon offset protocol is the baseline assumption, which is that the grassland is going to be converted to annual cropping. So this really means, this gets to the heart of, is this soil carbon store at risk of being lost? And it's the reason for this baseline assumption is that's what the underlying science for this protocol is built from. So the implications of this are that the credits are generated for the avoided loss of carbon stores. Like I said, the risk of conversion is really fundamental, proving that soil carbon store is at risk of loss. The project itself is the act of conserving the grassland. To do that, we look at a land conservation agreement. We would call them a conservation easement or an easement here in Alberta. I'm not sure what the term is in Ontario. It could be an agreement or a covenant or a servitude. Something that's going to guarantee that grassland is preserved. And getting into that principle of being conservative, we also have to account for the emissions from the project. So in terms of actually keeping and maintaining and conserving that grassland, any emissions that come from actually doing that need to be counted. So if you were grazing cattle, for example, on that piece of grassland, we have to count for the emissions that come from the cattle that are grazing, because if the grassland was converted, those emissions wouldn't occur. Should say that we do account for all the emissions that would occur if the grassland was converted to a cropping situation, like fertilizer use. But we just have to make sure that we're being conservative in the way that we quantify that. So in terms of who's eligible, the grassland has to have been grassland for at least 10 years. We're including both native and tame grasslands in that. The reason for that is that the grassland has to have a certain soil carbon stock before we can include it in this protocol and apply the underlying science. Like I said, the risk of conversion is key here. So there must be no existing legal protection to prevent that grassland from being converted. It must be physically suitable to produce crops. So it must be capable of producing crops. So we look at soil classes, slope, any moisture restrictions to see that, prove that grassland is capable of producing annual crops. And finally, we look at financial additionality. So we look at whether the land is going to be worth more as cropland and how much it's likely to be worth as cropland versus that value as grassland. It can be multiple discrete parcels, so it doesn't have to be one piece of continuous grassland. It can be lots of smaller pieces that we can tie together. In terms of basic requirements of the protocol, so like I said, the signing of the land conservation agreement is really the crux of it. It means that grassland is preserved. In terms of other requirements, there must be no breaking of the ground. That's not strictly true. I think on a case-by-case basis, we'll look at whether we can do a little bit of minimal tillage for rejuvenation or reseeding occasionally. So, but that's we can't do full tillage, and we can't be breaking the ground in that way and losing that soil carbon. Moderate grazing and moderate haying are allowed. Moderate really just gets to the point that we don't want to be losing that soil carbon store due to overgrazing or too much haying. And then finally, in terms of the monitoring, so there's going to be some monitoring requirements that should be quite should be fairly like low touch. Should be fairly lenient. But that's going to have to happen for the full permanence term. And then finally, like I said, we have to sort of make sure that the grassland is that the health of the grassland is maintained, and we do that by looking at the ecosystem health assessment every 6 years. I should say a lot of this we're looking at reviewing a little bit in our pilot project. So looking at remote sensing technologies, seeing where they can fit in and reduce some of the workload and the burden and the cost for some of these activities. So that's where we are today. But going back to those slides I presented on, those different types of protocols that we looked at in terms of, practice-based protocol or measurement-based protocol, and how we can reward landowners for the actual additional soil carbon that they're sequestering through different management practices. We were lucky enough to do a project funded by Alberta Innovates and CFGA just this last fall to look into this question of how can we actually make those quantify those soil carbon changes from management with a view to making that opportunity available in a carbon offset market. So, like I kind of said up front, soil carbon variability across the landscape requires many samples to address the accuracy concerns. Soil carbon stock measurements can change quite substantially just over small areas, which means you have to take a lot of samples to get a good, accurate measurement of soil carbon stocks over a field. You add to that, the very small incremental changes over time. We have to take a lot of samples, which can be really expensive and obviously disruptive to operations. The expense of actually taking those samples, any expense in developing these carbon offset projects, is an expense that has to be paid rather than going in the pocket of the landowner. Also, we obviously said up front that the land management practices themselves actually vary really significantly between farms, between managers, and the scientific understanding is not yet advanced to make that prediction on soil carbon change against the land management information. So, like I said, I kind of covered a lot of this already, but soil carbon change over time, which requires really good quality data spanning at least several years actually make that detection accurate. Our remote sensing technologies are unable to do that right now. And yeah, researching good quality soil carbon data sets linked with land management information are really expensive to generate and not really compiled or tabulated in a central database. But that compilation of all the data and information that we have right now is really, that's what's needed to enhance scientific understanding. So in terms of the objectives of the project, like I said, really we're looking at ways to quantify soil carbon change in Canadian grasslands as a result of grassland management. It's a real scientific and data gap, and with a focus on enabling environmental markets to develop for grassland management for climate mitigation. So we reviewed all the projects and programs that are working on this problem globally. We did a scan of what's going on, and obviously we've been working in this space for a good few years now already. And then we drafted a strategy for what we thought was our best approach, using the existing data. It had to be low cost, like I said, to ensure that the revenue actually flows back to the landowner or the grassland manager. At the end of all this, has to be accurate to appease the buyers of the carbon offsets, and it has to happen over a feasible timeline. We can't be asking managers to manage their grassland in a certain way and then for 5 years, and then at the end of 5 years you may or may not get some revenue from carbon offsets. That's not going to be practical to implement. So we took this plan, this strategy, we did a lot of stakeholder engagement with lots of academic and research institutions, government, technology providers, industry associations, consultants, other experts. Basically ask them to help us kind of draft out this strategy, and we also collected a list of the existing data sets and monitoring sites that people are already working on this question within Canada. So the strategy itself that we, after all the engagement and everything, the strategy itself that we came up with was this basically an observation network paired with models. So we looked at, basically I'll start from the beginning. Soil organic carbon models always require actual measurements on the ground, at least for calibration and for validation as well. So we need to basically make these models, ensure that these models work compared to the on the ground measurements. That's why we need data sets looking back at least several years with the high quality data that collecting that high quality data. We also need those data sets to cover a wide range of practices, land types, and weather. It's not necessarily, it doesn't have to represent all of it, but a good sample of those different variables. And we also need to ensure that we've got some ongoing measurement sites, so we keep taking those measurements and keep those models updated and continue to improve over time. This was the lowest cost and the most versatile kind of way that we could think of doing this, of designing this. And it would mean that we could predict soil carbon change over different landscapes and over different timeframes, including being able to generate carbon credits, maybe even annually, or much less than what we would have to be waiting for a measurement-based type of protocol. So yeah, I think I've kind of touched on this, but the summary of it really is that it would be a national network of monitoring sites collecting the high quality data on soil carbon and land use or land management data that we need to feed into those models. It would be linked with those soil carbon models to enable prediction over different geographies and timeframes. And then as part of this, there would have a data sharing network between all the stakeholders that are providing the data into this network, to enhance that scientific research and scientific understanding, and keep that scientific understanding kind of evolving over time. Just to cover over this kind of in a little bit more detail, I suppose. The circle on the left-hand side is looking at the monitoring sites that we would need to feed into this larger network. So you can see that we've got experimentation and demonstration sites, taking those measurements and also pairing it with the land management information. And again, there would be farms, individual farms that we would want to be pulling in there too. Our scientist thinks that about 50 or 60 sites would be plenty or enough, at least, to kind of do this. So it's not a huge number of sites that we're talking about, but it's the quality of the data that's going to be the key. And then across the top there, we'd taken all the other kind of remote sense data that we can get a hold of in terms of soils and weather data, and then farm management data too. So yeah, and then that would all kind of be thrown into the mix with the models and the observational measurements, and then the idea is that this would roll out to any grassland across Canada. We could then predict what the soil carbon change was going to happen from whatever farm management data that we get from that particular farm. So it's a big undertaking, but we think it's probably the lowest cost and most efficient way of designing an opportunity for grassland soil carbon from grassland management. So given that it's such a big task to take on, we wanted to focus on a short-term strategy first, which was basically developing the capacity to take this on through a data repository network. So basically just collecting all the existing data that we have, and all the existing monitoring sites that we have, and building this network or this database of existing knowledge and information, and figuring out all the data sharing implications and agreements and things, and building the team. The long-term strategy again is to build the CAFGON is the name of this this larger network. It stands for Canadian Foraging Grasslands Observation Network. So that would be, the long-term strategy is to build that big framework with the models and all the data feeding into it. Yeah, so that's the long-term strategy. And in terms of where we are, so we've obviously started the discussion with a lot of the stakeholders through the engagement, and started compiling this list of data sets and research sites that we have. And we're then now putting together the team to take this forward. It's been suggested that the CFGA could be a good role for the Secretariat here, just because there's risk with setting this up in government, and there's also risk with setting this up in the private sector due to policy change, change in funding. So yeah, that's the one place that this could be housed. And we're now reaching out for funding from various sources to get started at least on that short-term strategy, and prove the concept of the bigger network. So that's all my slides, but I'll keep my screen shared in case. I think I've seen some questions coming in, but I haven't actually seen them. So I'll end there.
All right, thank you so much, John. I'm gonna ask Cedric to also unmute and turn on his camera, and I'm gonna field some questions to you guys. There we go.
That's good.
So the first question I have for you is, given the current price of soybeans, how is this protocol going to discourage land conversion?
The avoided conversion protocol. It really depends on the price of carbon offsets, right? So right now in Alberta, the price for a carbon offset is $40 per ton of carbon. Now, using a real, it's risky to say numbers in this context, but a rule of thumb that we've been using is about 1 ton per hectare on average. Now that can sway wildly either way, but if we estimate 1 ton per hectare per year, $40 per hectare per year is something that we would be looking at. Now, if we're now talking at $170 per hectare per year, that changes the conversation, obviously. But really, this isn't going to be, the protocol itself isn't going to change the conversation. It's more of a, we're seeing it as more of a, the guys that are on the fence about doing this, about putting an easement or, some kind of restriction on the land to prevent that conversion. Maybe this is the cherry on top that gets them over the line.
Okay, thanks. Cedric, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I would just say that, the avoided conversion of grasslands protocol is, there are certainly going to be areas of Eastern Canada, Quebec, Ontario and the Maritimes where it does play. But I think the soil carbon roadmap concept, and I just made a note in the chat over here, just back and forth with Jack a little bit on this. I think that soil carbon roadmap is meant to understand how carbon is accumulating, within resilient cropping systems, right? Good diversified rotations. We're using no-till. We got perennials included. We're doing cover crops. Like, we're getting that incremental build in carbon over time. So that's why, and that was where we set out to go, as John mentioned early on, but we just couldn't get there because the data is too coarse. So I think in due time, we're going to see, as we see more focus on, soil health and a renewed focus on soil conservation, that soil carbon roadmap is going to start to create the environment where we can have that conversation, especially when carbon goes, to $100 plus.
Okay, so this is another question coming in. So why not reverse the process, and in a regulatory market, have it so that people who break up grasslands are paying the carbon prices because they're losing that carbon that was stored in the soil?
It's more of a tax for conversion rather than a carrot for non-conversion, right?
I guess flipping that on its head would be, that's absolutely
that's why I think is that the government probably doesn't want to be making that policy decision for a tax on land conversion versus a carrot to not convert.
Fair enough. Okay.
And I think this goes back a long ways on policy too, Christine. We're back 2 decades where, we talked about agriculture being 10% of the problem, 20% of the solution, and trying to drive more carbon underground. The ag industry fought hard against any sort of greenhouse gas regulation, but still wanting to have the upside to get paid for carbon offsets. So this is a policy enigma that's been around for 2 decades at least.
Okay, thanks. So who ultimately would be paying producers for carbon credits? Is that government? Is it industry? Like, how does that structure work? We now have a protocol so that producers could get paid, but who pays them?
It really depends on the market. So right now, this opportunity is only available in the Climate Action Reserve voluntary market. We're pushing very hard to get it into a compliance market, but we haven't had any luck for the last 3 years. But so on a voluntary market, the buyer, the eventual buyer is any company that just voluntarily wants to offset its emissions. So, Microsoft or Google, any of these big companies, particularly the big companies that you see are making net zero announcements. Any company that wants to get to net zero has to buy carbon offsets on the voluntary market. So because the price for a carbon offset in the voluntary market is driven by supply and demand, and a lot of these big companies are making targets for net zero emissions, it means that the demand for carbon offsets on the voluntary market is going to get quite high. That's what people are expecting to happen. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next few years. But in terms of if we were to get this opportunity in a compliance market, a regulated market, it's the purchasers or whichever companies are regulated by that market and need to meet the requirements of that regulation. So any regulated entity that's got the emissions above its allowable amount of emissions, they can buy offsets to meet that regulation.
Okay, so a lot of farmland, including our hayfields and our pastures, a lot of that is rented ground. So is it the landowner or the producer that's actually farming that property that is eligible for the payment?
That's a good question. So how did I put this the other day? I was quite proud of it. It's whoever actually owns that atom of carbon is the owner of the carbon offset in this respect. So if you think of this as soil carbon, it's whoever actually owns that carbon in the soil is the default owner of the carbon offset. So that in this case, that would be the landowner, right? Because they would own that piece of land. However, what normally happens in these types of projects is that there's a bunch of contracts that transfer ownership from the default landowner to up the chain through aggregators and through different people. So not to add too much complexity to it, but to answer your question simply, it's the landowner owns it and they get to decide what they want to do with that ownership.
Okay, thanks. So approximately how long would it take to accumulate a ton of carbon in a permanent pasture situation? Keeping in mind that we're humid in Eastern Canada. This isn't the prairies.
That's really difficult to say because getting back to that question of soil carbon stocks and also the variability across different landscapes. That's why we couldn't do this that type of a protocol right now. That's why we've gone for the avoided conversion rather than the accumulation of stocks over time. So I don't have that answer at the tip of my fingers because it's so variable on so many different factors that it would be impossible to really make a prediction. I think. I don't know, Cedric. Maybe you've got a number, but.
Well, yeah, and this is always a dangerous lake to wade into. But I think, from our initial research, John, we saw that, in the humid areas of the country, where we get more biomass growth, we are typically getting more root growth, and therefore the indication would be more carbon storage. But like you say, that the balance between being wetter and warmer and soil biological activity and right on and on and on we go. But I think, when we get out of the dry prairie areas, we typically get a better opportunity to move in that direction. So then you start to ask yourself, well, what are the limiting factors, right, of biomass productivity, right? And can we fertilize? Can we lime, right? Is it species? Is it C4s versus C3s, right? Like, how do we mix it up? Is it some annuals in there, right? And I think that's where we're looking at some of these complex interactions with the soil and the plant, and even animals in the soil carbon roadmap to really try and drill that down. And I guess the best example we have is a Prairie Soil Carbon Balance Report. I mean, they ran that project for 20 years and looked at those soil carbon stock changes over time. We haven't got anything even close to that when it comes to forages on the landscape. So it's a huge gap.
Okay. You mentioned in your talk that that conservation easement has to account for not breaking ground. And I know from conversations that I've had with producers, this is a big sticking point. We've got some acidic soil types in Eastern Canada, and lime works best when you incorporate it to keep those grasslands productive. Sometimes when we need to overseed to make sure that that grassland stays productive enough to continue keeping it as grassland, like sometimes there's management that involves breaking ground, not necessarily moldboard plow, flip it over, but working it. Can we talk a little bit about that gray area? Like what is absolutely a no-go in those conservation easements? Where is there some wiggle room so that we can actually have that normal farm management take place?
So there's two things I think to answer here. So on one side, you've got the easement. That is actually just there to provide the permanence to say that grassland is not going to get converted to another land use, right? That's all that easement has to do. Then you've got the requirements of the protocol, on the other hand, which is solely concerned with keeping that soil carbon store in the soil, in the ground. So between the two, the landowner has to negotiate an easement with a land trust, with a qualifying organization. That's a negotiation between the landowner and the land trust, and that's always been the case, and it won't change with this project, with this protocol. So on the protocol side of things, I think this is one of the questions that we're going to have to answer in our pilot, because this is a brand new protocol. There's always going to be questions like this come up. The Climate Action Reserve is the regulator. They get the ultimate say on whether something is viable or not, whether an activity is viable or not. I think that's just going to be something that we're going to have to figure out during the pilot as to where that line is. But the ultimate thing, for the regulator is that they want to make sure that carbon offset is a robust, reliable offset, and that in the context of this protocol, it's that soil carbon is maintained in the soil.
Okay. Does the amount of organic matter in the soil influence the rate of carbon sequestration?
Depends on the question, I think, a little bit. Cedric, were you going to say something, or should I take that one?
No, I just see Lauren Carter wanted to answer it live, but I guess that's you, Lauren Carter, right, Christine?
Yeah, the account's under Lauren's
I just
name.
saw a note.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
In terms of this protocol, it does take, it's very coarse, the science that it takes into the underlying science. So it does take into account the types of soils across Canada at a very coarse level. So in that respect, it would. That's for the avoided conversion of grasslands protocol. In terms of the science behind, additional sequestration based on existing soil organic matter, I'm not too sure. I know that there's, grassland soils are expected to reach a plateau at a certain time in terms of the amount of soil carbon that they can store. But again, the scientific communities doesn't have consensus on that, I would say, even so. So Cedric, you can probably add a bit more to that.
Well, and I think it's a great question, because if you take a look at it, high organic matter soils are going to be probably a little bit more productive, right? They're higher in organic matter for a reason. And so if you can get more biomass production out of a high organic matter soil, and you've got more functional root and microbial biomass, continue to drive that storage and, and the accumulation of carbon, like say in both in long-term, root matter and biomass, maybe that is the unlocked opportunity for us to really drive that soil health and store it in the live component of the soil. So yeah, another great question that we don't have a great answer to. And I think the challenge with a question like that, because it's driven by biological systems, is it would depend on, are you in a wet cycle? Are you in a dry cycle? Are you in a shoulder slope position? Are you in a lower slope position? Are you in an eroded knoll, right? And you're going to see probably differences all the way across that field, depending on what that organic matter looked like and what's the biological activity at any point across the field, which comes back to John's point about the difficulty of running a measurement-based protocol. is just that variability in itself within, you know, a 20-acre field is mind-boggling, and the amount of samples you'd have to take to figure it out is wildly cost prohibitive.
That's what the soil carbon roadmap, the CAFCON, hopes to get to, right? Like we can take all that information, throw it into a big model, and it'll tell us the answer, hopefully.
All kinds of big, complicated unknowns here. Last question.
I think
that we have
Kim Schneider's going to be busy for the next decade.
We could keep her pretty busy.
Kim Schneider's going to be busy. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got time for one more question. Is land in the ALICE program eligible, or land in similar programs eligible?
That's a great question. Whoever else asked that. There's an ongoing kind of question in the environmental markets field, I would say, about stacking. We call it stacking. So stacking of different payments for different ecosystem goods and services. So ALICE is a good example of that, where they'll pay a landowner for multiple ecosystem goods and services. Now, yeah, whether you can also get carbon offsets at the same time as being paid by ALICE, it gets to that question of additionality. So if that grassland is not going to get converted because the landowner is receiving a payment from ALICE already, then the carbon offset is not additional. So effectively, the buyer of that carbon offset isn't buying anything, because that carbon offset, or that carbon, would have been stored anyway, regardless of whether the carbon offset is generated or not. So that's one argument. The other argument is,
could you stack them the other way around, though? Like if you got into your carbon program first, then ALICE doesn't have an additionality.
So that's fine. That way around is because the carbon offset is the one that came first.
This gets so complicated so fast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh.
So, but it's not. I think this is one of those gray areas where each market regulator is taking their own slightly different stance on it. So This protocol itself, the Climate Action Reserve, have said if all those incentives are made at the start of the project, they're all stacked at the same time, then that's fine, because it's obvious that all those payments are playing together to achieve that final aim. But if you were to sign up to one, some of the program 5 years ago, and now we'll try and sign up to a carbon offset, then that gets questionable.
Okay. Wow. Big stuff that you guys are working on. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to our chair, Terry Noon, to give some final thoughts. But thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very informative. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Cedric. Appreciate you guys being here on a Friday evening like that. And thanks from all of Ontario for that. Much appreciated. Our presenters have agreed to stay on after the formal webinar to answer further questions. I have some housekeeping to do to wrap up the webinar. If you're collecting CEU credits, please contact Patricia Ellingwood at support@ontarioforagecouncil.com or 519-377-9970 with your name and CCA verification number. The information is also available in the chat. Thanks again to our sponsors for their support of these webinars, the Beef Farmers of Ontario and the Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association. Thank you. And thanks a lot to Christine O'Reilly for putting this all together, as well as Patricia Ellingwood and James Byrne tonight for helping us out. Much appreciation for all the work that goes on behind the scenes for this as well. So thank you, everyone, and great week here for Profitable Pastures. So thanks again.
Thanks, Terry.
Okay, Terry promised a little bit more time for questions. So we've got a question about audit costs. Are they on a per hectare basis? Are they flat rate? Are they structured some other way?
So maybe I'll go back a step. Normally these projects, so auditing cost is a great question, because it's a cost that can be obstructive to these projects being financially viable. The way that, particularly in agriculture, so the way that that you can often get around that is by bunching together a lot of smaller projects into one big project. And that means that those costs for auditing and monitoring, verification, they're spread across all those smaller projects. So it depends, and that's usually done by a specialist. So that they'll usually be called a project developer or an aggregator, because they aggregate lots of smaller projects into one. So it depends, and they usually charge a fee for that, and there's lots of different ways you can set up those contracts between the landowner and the project developer or the aggregator. So that kind of depends on what that aggregator puts in that contract and what you agree to on that. If you were to do it on your own, maybe you have a big piece of grassland that you think you can, is going to be feasible to do on its own, then the landowner would be liable for all the costs to actually develop the project.
Okay, so like everything else with these carbon markets, not a simple answer.
It's kind of simple. I mean, normally we say that the aggregator normally takes somewhere between 15 and 25% of the total revenue of the carbon offset when it's sold, which, when you think about, any supply chain, commodity supply chain, if the actual supplier of the commodity is getting 75-80% of the final sale value of that commodity, like that doesn't, it looks pretty good, right? So it depends how you look at it. But
all right, Cedric, I guess the CFGA decided to go down this protocol development road. Why not lobby governments to change how they pay into other programs? Why go a carbon market route with this project instead of a different direction?
Yeah, so good question. I see Jim's posed that here in the chat. Early on, when I joined the CFGA, I mean, there was kind of rumblings about soil carbon and the recognition around the board table that we didn't have any sort of semblance of a protocol that would help us to move this into market reality. So we took a shot at a program and grabbed the funding, and it's become a fairly major part of what we do. And I think that was very timely because things have really evolved very quickly within this space since we started that AGGP project. So Jim's comments about changes to BRM, I think you mentioned the RMP program, which would be Ontario specific. The last thing we want to do is not support our partners on the landscape in the annual cropping sector. Is there a challenge, in keeping, to Jack Kyle's question, the net profitability on soybeans these days versus an alfalfa crop or a perennial pasture? Is that a challenge financially to pencil that? You bet. Do we need to change our BRM program? Do we need to take a look at our BRM programming to make sure that we maintain forages on the landscape and do all the good things from water filtration and control and riparian zone and biodiversity and soil carbon storage and maintaining our livestock sectors to bring the manure in? Absolutely. So, I mean, I think, Jim, I'd take the middle road, I guess, to answer your question, to say, scrapping all of that isn't an answer. Do we need to have the conversation about how we protect these various landscape features, i.e. annuals and perennials on the landscape? Absolutely. And we're seeing those conversations starting to evolve, and people are taking a hard look at the landscape as a whole and understanding all the functionality of the individual pieces. And I think when you take a look at, I put it in the chat a little bit earlier, between 2011 and 2016 in Ontario, census data says there's 700,000 acres of grassland that were lost. So how much of that went to urban development, I don't know. That's a pretty specific case in Ontario.
And it's hard to tell
But how
from
much of
those
that got
census
lost to
numbers.
annual cropping? Exactly, Christine. And it's hard to lean on those. And that's why, we're pushing hard to have an inventory so we can better understand, how change is evolving over time. What I'd really like to see, and I was going to make this point a little bit earlier about carbon, because we're starting to ask the question, what does it mean per acre? I would say the better question is, what is a 3-year stint of alfalfa worth in a corn and soybean rotation? If you can trade land with your neighbor, what's 150 pounds of free nitrogen worth? What's an extra point of organic matter worth? Maybe over that 10-year period when you're, developing and maintaining a more diversified cropping system. What does it mean to fertilize, an alfalfa timothy crop and to grab, extra 2/3 a ton of dry matter per acre? It's worth $200 an acre, right? Just the agronomics and making sure that we're driving the productivity out of our land, every acre of land that we can. And we know that when we link perennials into cropping systems with annuals, we get those kind of benefits for everybody. So we need to figure out, how we can partner for landscape management and hopefully all see a few bucks in our pocket at the end of the day.
And I will make a note that Jack mentioned in the comments, most of the grassland gets lost to grains and oilseeds, and most of the land that gets development on it is already in grains and oilseeds, but it's that shift as urban spaces go where there were annual crops go where there were perennials. So thanks, Jack. All right. Well, sorry, go ahead, Cedric.
Can I follow up with that?
Yeah.
Can I follow up with that? Because it seems to be, a pretty strong trend line here. Maybe we're losing those perennials maybe because they were small land holdings, or maybe they were large land holdings, and they were, cow-calf operators that said, I got to get out of this. I retired. Nobody wanted to come and keep the cows. I mean, is there a direct linkage to the beef herd in Ontario and whether or not those perennials have a home anymore? I guess that would be a question that I would pose.
And I think it's a fair question. Yeah, I think it's a fair question. I don't know if we have a clear answer, but some of those numbers track quite closely as far as acres and herd and flock sizes. So.
Yeah. So, adding good things, or maybe an evolution of our forage crop insurance program, or, making sure that our BRM programs are working really effectively for the cow-calf sector to make sure that they can compete on the landscape. Is that a way to keep perennials in the system? I think those are all questions that need to be thrown on the table when we start talking about BRM.
Okay. Well, thank you both for taking the time tonight to talk to us a little bit more about how carbon markets work and the place that this protocol can fill as far as getting the ball rolling on farmers playing in these carbon offset markets. So yeah, I'd like to echo Terry's comments. Thank you so much for spending your Friday night, and thanks to all of you who stuck it out with us to the very end.